In the last section, we spoke about how we might use volumes as a way of persisting data outside of a container when that data is something that we care about and we want to have be persisted across restarts or termination of a given container, specifically or most especially ones that are running a database of some sort. Now in this section, we're going to start talking about volumes in the world of Kubernetes. The first thing I want to clarify is a little piece of terminology. It's actually the word volume itself. I want to tell you a little bit about what the word volume means in the world of Kubernetes. All right, so first things first, there's a little discussion about terminology. In the last section, I was using the word volume over and over and over again. When I was using the word volume in the last section, it was kind of as a generic term in container terminology world. And it was a reference to some type of data storage mechanism that allows a container to store data outside of its own little file system. However, in the world of Kubernetes, the term volume is a reference to a very particular type of object. An object in the same sense that a deployment is an object or a service is an object. So in the world of Kubernetes, we can write a configuration file that will create something called a volume. In Kubernetes, that object is something that allows a container to store some persistent data at the pod level. In addition to the use of volumes, we also have access to two other types of data storage mechanisms, both something called a persistent volume claim and a persistent volume. So in this section, I want to expand upon what a volume is in the world of Kubernetes just a little bit so that you understand that when we use the word volume with Kubernetes, it's a reference to a very particular thing, and it's very different than referring to something called a persistent volume or a persistent volume claim. Now, we're not going to make use of volumes for everything that we're doing. We're not going to use volumes at all. I just want you to understand that this is a completely separate thing. And so when you start to look at documentation and you see documentation that says, oh yeah, create a volume, you have to create a distinction between what a volume is and a persistent volume is. Otherwise, when you're reading that documentation, you're going to get really, really confused. Okay, so with that in mind, this section, we're going to look at a diagram that explains exactly what a volume object type is in Kubernetes. All right. So I want to again consider our Postgres deployment. Let's imagine we have a deployment that manages a single pod, and that pod has a single Postgres container. When we create a volume in Kubernetes, we are creating a little kind of data storage pocket that exists or is tied directly to a very specific pod. So you'll notice in this diagram, I'm reflecting this volume right here that's going to store some amount of data as being kind of like inside the pod. It's essentially kind of like belongs to or is associated to the pod in some fashion. Now this volume can be accessed by any container inside of the pod. So for example, if we had a Postgres container running, it could store all of its data inside of this volume that belongs to the pod itself. Now the benefit to using this volume here is that if this container, like this one specifically, ever dies or crashes and gets restarted as a completely new container, like so, let's imagine that we get a second Postgres container and the old one gets killed, so I'm going to mark it as red right there. Then this new Postgres container has access to all of that data in that volume. And so that might sound like exactly what we were just talking about in the last section. We're essentially saying, oh yeah, new container gets created. Well, the new container gets access to that same volume and it has access to all the data that the previous container had access to as well. However, here's the downside. The volume is tied to the pod. And so if the pod itself ever dies, the volume dies and goes away as well. So a volume in Kubernetes will survive container restarts inside of a pod, but if the pod itself, for whatever reason, ever gets recreated or terminated, deleted, whatever happens, then the pod and the volume inside of it, poof, totally gone. And then, of course, the deployment would kick in and recreate that pod with a volume inside of it. So as you might guess, in the world of Kubernetes, a volume is really not appropriate for storing data for a database. It definitely works in the sense that the container can restart, but we still are weak or we're still kind of vulnerable to anything going wrong at the pod level itself. All right, so that's why we're not going to use volumes. And just so you know, in real life, as I say volume, I'm doing like, double quotes around myself to say, specifically a Kubernetes volume. That's why we're not using a Kubernetes volume. All right, so now that we've clarified that little piece of terminology, we're going to come back to the next section and we'll talk more about exactly what a persistent volume is and a persistent volume claim. So quick pause, and I'll see you in just a minute.